Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a este seminario que nos ofrece la doctora Karen O'Brien, quien es profesora del Departamento de Sociología y Geografía Humana de la Universidad de Oslo, en Noruega. Ella es cofundadora de Sea Change, una organización que liga la investigación con la acción para fomentar las transformaciones hacia la sostenibilidad. La investigación de la doctora O'Brien enfatiza las dimensiones sociales y humanas del cambio climático, incluyendo la relación entre cambio climático, adaptación y transformaciones a la sostenibilidad. Ella se interesa en el rol que juegan las creencias, valores, cosmovisiones y los paradigmas en la generación de conciencia social del cambio. Tiene varios libros y los más recientes incluyen You Matter More Than You Think, Quantum Social Science for the Thriving World y Climate and Society, Transforming the Future, del cual es coautora con Robin Leichenko. La doctora O'Brien fue nombrada recientemente por el Web of Science como una de las investigadoras con mayor influencia de la década pasada. En 2021 recibió el premio de la Fundación BBVA, Fronteras del Conocimiento del Cambio Climático. Para nosotros es un honor tener a la doctora O'Brien y debemos agradecerle este seminario a Lakshmi Charlie y a Karen por estar aquí, por tener esta magnífica oportunidad. So, Karen, thank you very, very much for being with us, and it's all yours. Thanks.
Okay, muchas gracias, Marissa, and hello to everybody. And I'm going to share my screen, and can you see that, Marissa?
Yes, we can see that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, and what I'd like to talk about tonight, or this afternoon for you in Mexico, is transformative change and why I think it's all about relationships. And I'm going to kind of walk you through the way I think about change, because we're hearing a lot these days about transformations. We know that transformations are imminent. It's either be transformed or consciously transform, where we're at right now. Because of climate change, biodiversity loss, many types of environmental changes taking place right now at a rate, a scale, and a speed and a depth that is hard to imagine. So the questions I ask in my research are, how do we consciously transform at the scope, the scale, the speed, and the depth that is called for by global change research? And it's not just any type of transformation that is going to lead us on a sustainable pathway. So the question I also ask is, how do we transform in an equitable, ethical, and sustainable manner? And this brings us to a really deep theoretical and philosophical question on what is the relationship between individual change, collective change, and systems change. In other words, does what I do matter? Does what we do matter? How do we actually shift systems and cultures in order to provide a world where all life can thrive? So for that, I think we really need to look more deeply at relationships. And relationships can be just defined very simply as the way in which two or more people or things are connected, or the state of being connected. And if we start to think about transformative change through the lens of relationships, we start to see that what we do actually is shifting systems all the time. And I'm going to end with my recent project called You Matter More Than You Think. But right now, we are very much in a divisive world where we've actually drawn a line between me and you and us and other and society and the environment and humans and nature. And this line has really led to objectification, it's led to colonization, it's led to oppression of a lot of different people and exploitation of resources and species. And I think that, if you look at this image of the line in the sand, it is just a construction that we've drawn. And for me, this type of construction has really led to a world that is very much fragmented. We see more and more polarization in society today, and we're really seeing that this idea that we might have sustainability that works for one group but not another group. And we might be addressing climate change, but then biodiversity loss is accelerated, or poverty is increasing. And there's so many things that we're not actually looking at it as a whole and thinking about how do we transform so that it, that we at a global level. And rather than having fragments, I think we can think of, how do we change patterns? And what I'm thinking of now is almost like fractal patterns, patterns that are self-similar and repeat at all different scales. And I think we see this in nature, in beehives, and in leaves, in rivers and coastlines, also in algebra and geometry. And so one of the questions I think we really need to ask is, how do we actually create new patterns that actually can transform systems? And this brings me to my research project on adaptation and adaptation as transformation, because I think it's clearly time for us to adapt, not just to the impacts of climate change or changing ecosystems, but it's really time to adapt to the very idea that we are transforming the global environment and that we are influencing the environment for millennia to come. And to me, this is really comes together in a project that I'm just wrapping up now called Adaptation Connects. And the connects part in English stands for combining old and new knowledge to enable conscious transformations to sustainability. And in this project, we're really interested in looking at that relationship between adaptation and transformations through qualities like creativity, qualities like collaboration, empowerment of individuals and groups, and also flexibility of our mindsets and our stories and narratives. And so in this project, we're looking at like the role of coffee in global value chains, science, art, interactions, in education, and how we empower people to actually think of themselves in terms of larger systems, and then travel connects, which includes how stories travel. So for me, this is really about thinking about how do we see ourselves as a whole, as part of one large ecosystem on planet Earth. And what's really important is that the way we frame problems really influences the types of solutions that we come up with. And I think when we frame transformative change as a relationship problem, we start to see different entry points for social change and for systems change. In fact, how we define a problem very much influences the types of solutions that we identify and also that we prioritize. They say that, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so, people are, in the name of climate change, in the name of biodiversity, we're applying the same almost like business as usual types of solutions that we've seen for over and over and over again. And the question is, how do we actually shift our the way that we look at problems? And for this, I've been looking at lots of different disciplines and different ways of looking at transformative change. And I came across this book on the practice of adaptive leadership, tools and tactics for changing your organization and the world. And these authors at Harvard identify two different approaches to change problems. The first type they talk about is a technical problem. And a technical problem involves those that can be diagnosed and solved by applying or improving established knowledge, know-how, and expertise. In other words, we need to improve our understanding, we need to improve our management, we need to really get better at figuring out solutions. And that's a lot of our emphasis on research goes into how do we fix technical problems. But they argue that there's another type of problem that is probably even more frequent, and these are adaptive problems. Adaptive problems have technical elements, but they also draw attention to our beliefs, our values, our worldviews, and our paradigms. In other words, our mindset. So when we look at adaptation to climate change, it's really about adapting the way we think about the problem, the way we perceive ourselves in relation to each other, in relation to nature, and in relation to the future. So when you look at climate change as an adaptive challenge, you start to see that what we're doing right now is treating it as pretty much a technical problem. We're trying to, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We're trying to fix all these problems as if the problem is carbon dioxide or the problem is, greenhouse gas emissions, rather than the way that we organize society. And these are the famous deck chairs on the Titanic. And I really feel that, right now we're shuffling around the deck chairs on the Titanic without actually shifting course and changing direction in any significant way. And I think many people are starting to realize that. And what we're doing is really, painting the deck chairs green, patting ourselves on the back and saying we're making this fantastic green transition, green transformations. But what we know is that if we address an adaptive challenge as if it were only a technical problem, it will lead to failure. And I think we're seeing these, that it's leading to failure. And there's a number of ways that you can identify adaptive challenges and distinguish them from technical problems. The first is when there's a persistent gap between aspirations and reality. We can think of that as the Aichi biodiversity targets or the Paris Climate Agreement or whatever. And we can think about where we want to be and where we're at. We also know that difficult learning is required because we're talking about like dynamic, physical complexity. We're talking about where cause and effect are separated. So what I do now is going to affect people on the other side of the planet, and what I do now is going to affect generations to come. But it's also social complexity, where we really have to start thinking about different groups have different objectives, different contexts, and also human complexity, our cognitive frameworks, our mindsets, our emotions, our identities, all of those things. So that it's much more than a complex problem. It's actually called a hyper-complex problem. And with adaptive challenges, new stakeholders need to be engaged. And this seems very clear with most of our environmental challenges. It's not just science giving information to society, but it's really about the co-production of knowledge and co-generation of new ways of seeing. Adaptive challenges also are, the telltale sign is when disequilibrium experienced as a sense of crisis is starting to be felt. And I think we've seen that we've felt this for decades, but it's becoming stronger and stronger and more evident with extreme events and with some of the data that we're seeing of really remarkable changes taking place right now, and not for the better. And finally, I think we recognize that it truly is an adaptive challenge when we are convinced that it's everybody else that needs to change rather than ourselves or our organizations or our societies or countries. And I think that there's this finger pointing that it's up to anyone but me to change. And we see this again and again every time we read the news or hear the latest reports coming out. We know that the wealth gap is widening for more than 70% of the global population. And this means that these environmental issues really are justice issues. We see injustice growing around the world. We see unprecedented extreme events, the US West's wildfires, the recent floods all over the world. We just see environmental catastrophes affecting people. So when we talk about the 1.5 goal, we have to recognize that that is dangerous climate change for many people, species, groups, or ecosystems. We see rampant destruction of forests will lead to other consequences, such as pandemics. And so we're seeing losses tied to so many things, not just forests, but to everything that we value. And we see that we're failing to meet so many of the targets that we've set up. So, and with the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, that we really are off track in terms of dealing with the dimensions of the problems that are facing us today. So I'm painting kind of a dismal picture of this. And sometimes I think, I just go, wow, what do we do now? And when you start to think about transformations at the rate and the scale and the speed and the depth, it really seems, overwhelmingly large. And I sometimes feel overwhelmingly insignificant and small. And I think how do we actually do this? And I think that that's the how of transformation becomes really, really important, because it's one thing to just say, oh, we need to transform, but another thing to say okay, how do we really do it? And transformation is becoming a buzzword and also a very vibrant area for research, and really great research coming out that is looking at it in practice. What can we learn from things going on in all different contexts of the world? When I think of the definition of transformation, I think of significant physical and/or qualitative changes in form, structure, and meaning making, which really is like the metamorphosis from a caterpillar to a butterfly, because it changes its form, it changes its structure, and also you can imagine that it changes its meaning making. The butterfly sees a different world than the caterpillar. And this is, I think, a very like kind of form, structure, and meaning ways, a simple way of looking at transformation. But I think it's also something much deeper that resonates with many of us, and that is the powerful unleashing of human potential to care and affect change for a better life. And this is really something that is in all of us that we can really start to think about. How do we do better from where we're at right now in November 2021? How do we actually, have this positive impact and unleash that potential that exists there? So the idea of the potential is something that I'm going to get to later on in the talk. But when I think about transformations to sustainability, I think about it in terms of 3 spheres of transformation that are always interacting. They're one and the same, but it helps us to really think about it through form, structure, and meaning making as the practical, the political, and the personal spheres. And I'm just going to walk you through these and think, just so that you can kind of think about like the different aspects and dimensions of transformative change that that come into play in every moment by all of us. And often when we focus on the technical dimensions and the behavioral responses, we're very much focused on the practical sphere of transformation, things that are measurable, the results that we really truly want to see, the 169 targets and indicators of the Sustainable Development Goals very much rely on practical changes. So this might mean that we want to have more solar panels and more renewable energy, more plant-based food, more girls in school, more bicycles, more, all of the things that we are really striving to achieve on the planets. But what we also see, as I showed you earlier, that we're not achieving any of these in a significant global scale. And so we're stuck with with this gap between our goals and our aspirations. And it's often because we are ignoring or not paying significant attention to the political sphere, the very systems and the structures by which we organize society. And I think of the structures as the social and cultural norms, the rules, the regulations, the incentives, the infrastructures. It's really how we collectively organize society. And in the political sphere, it's this is where we get the conflicts, because we have different ideas on how we should organize society, and we get into kind of inertia where it takes us decades to get to a voluntary agreement on climate change. And this is also the sphere where we see social movements, where we see that activation of collective agency, where people say like, wow, this is, we can actually work for equity and justice, and so on. And interestingly, the political sphere and the practical sphere are often, that's where like the policy practice interface lies, but we still are not transforming rapidly enough. And it's often because we're ignoring the personal sphere. The personal sphere is the individual and shared beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms through which we actually see systems, through which we design structures. How do we see ourselves in relation to systems? So it brings us back to this relationship dimension. And how do I relate to myself, to society, to nature, to the environment, to the future, etc. And so these are, always here all together, the personal, political, and practical. Often, however, that when we're talking about transformative change, we start to think about, well, okay, beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms. Yes, those are important. We need to change people's beliefs. We need to change their values. We need to change their worldviews, and we need to change their paradigms. And I don't know about any of you, but it's not that easy to change others in my personal experience. Nobody really likes to be an object to be changed, put into that practical sphere as if they're just something, like that is being changed in the name of something. most people like to feel that sense of agency, that they are actually part of a system, that they can change. And so when we look for the outcomes for sustainability, we start to see that, it is the intra-action of the personal, the political, and practical spheres in every moment. And I'm gonna, I don't know how many of you are familiar with a seminal paper by Donella Meadows on leverage points, on places to intervene in a system. And when she looks at what are the most powerful places to initiate systems change, she really focuses on the constants, parameters, and numbers, and the buffers relative to flows as very low leverage points. And I think this really tracks onto, or maps onto, the practical sphere of transformation. Whereas when we start thinking in terms of systems, in terms of stocks and flows and delays and feedback loops and information flows and the rules of the system, it gets into the political sphere, and you get much higher leverage when you're making the rules of the system. But I think the highest leverage points of Donella Meadows on the goals of the system, the mindset or paradigm from which the system arises, and the power to transcend paradigms, these really are very much part of that personal sphere, the individual and shared ways that we actually are seeing ourselves in the system. And so it's not just about looking for leverage points, it's also about being the leverage points. And I want to just go through some of those aspects of the personal sphere just to show you just how important that is. We may see, for example, a belief is an acceptance that something exists or is true, especially without proof. So I believe in climate change, or I believe that we can have a sustainable world. And our beliefs play a really important role in the ways we perceive a current situation and how we identify appropriate responses to this, as Niels Nielsen has written in Understanding Beliefs. And I want to just emphasize how important our beliefs really are, because they influence the way that we act, the types of responses that we prioritize, and so on. And so when you read in the Guardian newspaper, for example, in this 2017 article, the planet has just a 5% chance of reaching the Paris climate goal, the study says. It says that the researchers find that economic emissions and population trends point to very small chance Earth will avoid warming by more than 2 degrees Celsius by the century's end. And they say it's actually a 1% chance that we will limit it to 1.5. And if I read this in the newspaper, I'm likely to then just say, like, oh, there's not much I can do about, there's nothing we can do about climate change. We better just start to adapt to that 4-degree warmer world, or the 5-degree warmer world, or to chaos and catastrophe or whatever, because we can't do this. And you probably would spend less attention, really focusing on every possible, thousands of solutions that we could look at. And if you're like kind of a nerd and go into like, okay, let's look at the article that talks about why less than 2% warming is unlikely. You see that the forecasting model here does not explicitly incorporate changes in legislation that could change future emissions, and it's based on current emissions, and they have not accounted for the possibility of decreasing prices for alternative energy, which could cause a sudden massive shift to alternative energy. And they say that this would be speculative. So all of our models have assumptions based on beliefs about how we think the world works and how we think society operates. And I think that's really, really important to remember as we work on these. And so when I ask scientists, do you think we can limit climate change to 1.5? In theory, they'll say, oh, yes. That's what we're aiming for under the Paris Agreement. But true beliefs are often that, it's already too late. We should have acted 30 years ago. We should have been working much harder, and, we're already at 1.1 degree, and, forget it. Other beliefs that go along with this is that, people will never change. And sometimes you have a very small sample, like this, my partner, my mother, or whatever, an uncle, or things. But we tend to see, just to extrapolate changes. We may say that the payoff for renewables will never exceed fossil fuels, taking a very linear approach to renewable energy development. Some people will say the models say it's impossible, and the models are always right. And models are often very good, but they often, as I was talked about, they have some assumptions as well. Some people will say it's all just natural variability. You know, we've seen this in the Pliocene, Eocene thermal maximum 50 million years ago, or we've seen these types of changes before, and it really is the belief that this is just a normal variation. Some people will say that, oh, we can just adapt to this change. We've adapted to, we've adapted throughout history, and that should be no problem. And then finally, there's people who say, of course, we can limit climate change to 1.5 degrees. In fact, we can reverse global warming. And this is Paul Hawken's Drawdown project that is looking at, the hundreds of solutions to climate change. And when you look at what the science is saying, it is actually saying that we have this window of opportunity for reducing climate change. But that brings us then to issues that, like, why are we not doing this? And when we look at values and we look at the like Shalom Schwartz's structure of values, where he says that we share these values of conformity and tradition, security, power, achievement, hedonism, stimulation, self-direction, universalism, and benevolence, and they have motivating factors behind them, such as conservation and openness to change and self-enhancement and self-transcendence. And often in that political sphere, we get to clashes of values when one person's openness to change meets another person's conservation, or someone's self-enhancement meets someone else's self-transcendence. So a lot of the times what we're talking about in terms of political conflicts are value conflicts, and what we're talking about in terms of practical goals and things are really different visions for what the future would look like based on different values. And then we have different worldviews that are based on a whole bunch of different things that influence, like our cognitive perspective, our emotional development, our how we relate to each other, etc. And this gives each and every one of us a very different lens through which we look on the world, both individually and collectively. And each of us has different filters and different blind spots, and we're seeing the world through different vantage points. And it's not to say that, like, one, the being at the top of the mountain and having a big perspective is bigger, because as we know, we need to actually understand what's in the soil, what's in our local environments and things. So it's really just to acknowledge that there are many different perspectives on the challenges that we're facing today. And that brings us to paradigms, which are the sources of systems. And through them come the shared social agreements about the nature of reality and the information flows, feedback, and everything else about systems. And that's why when I start to think about, like, how do we transform in that big picture, I think we really do need to be working with paradigms right now, the shared thought patterns about the nature of reality and relationships. And that brings me then to really a lot of the way that we're seeing the world right now still is linked to an Enlightenment worldview and a paradigm that is based on a mechanistic, atomistic, deterministic, reductionist, and material view of the world. And this is just one perspective, and it's been criticized for a long time, but it also still has a lot of power in the way that we approach science. There are other worldviews, and Andreas Weber has called this an Enlightenment worldview, which is based on lived experience, embodied knowledge, subjectivity, consciousness, interbeing, and spirituality. And this is a worldview that is shared by many indigenous cultures, wisdom traditions, and so on. And I think that moving to that enlightenment isn't trying to replace the Enlightenment worldview so much as to widen it and deepen it and to see it from a different perspective. And if we think about how this shows up in science, a very mechanistic and siloed approach really just tries to connect things into one big picture here. And this is the famous Brotherton diagram of Earth system science that was developed in the 1970s. And you can see that, on the very right side, that it's, humans are just kind of like feeding into the system and being impacted by the system. But, it's soil development that is at the center of the diagram. When we start, think about it from an Enlightenment worldview, we start to see not just that these things are different boxes and algorithms and paradigms, but that the entire, biosphere, atmosphere, cryosphere, all of these things are actually living, have dynamic entities. And this is a drawing from Tone Bjordam, who I asked to make a simple diagram of a simple drawing of the Brotherton diagram. And I think it really captures that there's so much more complexity than what we can actually capture. And for me, it's been really interesting to just go in through science itself and see that quantum mechanics and science itself has been challenging that Enlightenment paradigm for over 100 years. And it's caused physicists to, I can't read the, let me just see if I can move this so I can, oops. It's forced physicists to reshape their ideas of reality, to rethink the nature of things at the deepest level, and to revise their concepts of position and speed and the notions of cause and effect. And this is at the subatomic level of electrons and photons and so on. And it's been thought that we live in this classical world and where classical physics dominates, and we know that ice melts at certain temperatures and sea levels rise, et cetera, but we haven't really thought about how small things can actually make a big difference in that world. And so there has been a lot of questioning of this idea that there's two separate realities. And quantum biology, for example, is an emerging field that's looking at processes like photosynthesis and bird navigation and sense of smell as classical phenomena that are influenced by quantum processes, quantum tunneling, et cetera. And these authors kind of tongue-in-cheek say quantum mechanics is normal. It's the world that it describes that is weird. And it really is saying that, we're not living in like two separate realities, but it's more that in the, at one level, certain things wash out, the quantum effects wash out and become statistically predictable. Quantum physics is telling us that we live in a probabilistic universe of uncertainty, of both and, of waves and particles. And social scientists looking at this in terms of, what does this mean for society, are starting to really challenge some of the older ways of classical social science. And Alexander Wendt, a political scientist, says if human beings really are quantum, then classical social science is essentially founded on a mistake, and social life will therefore require a quantum framework for its proper understanding. And he's arguing that it's not just that, he says that we're walking wave functions, but it's not just like through this woo-woo kind of stuff, but it's through our language, through our shared contexts. The idea that language, that we're collapsing meaning through our speech acts of talking and listening. And I think it's a very provocative idea that he presents there, but he's not the only one. And there are more and more people that are looking at what quantum perspectives mean for the social world and how it relates to indigenous worldviews and new materialism and lots of social science theories that have been around for decades. In Meeting the Universe Halfway, Karen Barad writes about the entanglement of matter and meaning, and she talks about matter as not a thing, but a doing, a congealing of agency through which phenomena come to matter. In other words, she's saying that we're constantly mattering, literally creating these substances in our intra-actions in the world. And it's a very exciting book, but also very dense. And I think that but the heart of it is that, that we actually are mattering in every moment. And this really led me to question, if we take some of these paradigms and look at, transformations and social change, what does it mean for issues like climate change? What does it mean for issues like biodiversity loss? And so I just finished a project that has taken me probably 10 years or 6 years of writing on, called You Matter More Than You Think, Quantum Social Change for a Thriving World. And in it, it's really an open inquiry into what does it actually mean if we think from a different paradigm, if we take Donella Meadows' leverage points seriously. And here, in thinking about it, I think that quantum social change for me describes a conscious, nonlinear, and non-local approach to transformations that's grounded in our inherent oneness. It recognizes that we are entangled through language, meaning, and shared context, and that our deepest intentions are the potential for individual change, collective change, and systems change. And so in the book, which was it was part of the Art Connects project and a close collaboration with artist Tone Bjordam, who could really take some very abstract ideas and really connect it with the natural world in a way that I think was really beautiful. And so I look at paradigms and beliefs and relationships, metaphors, entanglement, consciousness, agency, and fractals to get to this idea of why you matter more than you think, and why we need to start thinking ourselves not as like you and me, but I and we as a bracketed term. And so in relationships matter, if we start to shift from seeing ourselves in these very classical causal relationships to seeing us as part of a quantum system where we are entangled, where we are, where the dividing lines between subject and object and I and we are ambiguous, then, we start to actually realize that we don't have the right vocabulary, nor do we have the right grammar to express how do we relate to nature and each other. And this is really pulling us into seeing things, as like whole parts and I, we, and recognizing also that many cultures have the words for this. They have the language to see that the other is me, that, that we are one and the same. And but I also think, going back to the importance of language, we have to look not just at, like, okay, is the world quantum or not? And you can debate that for decades and things, but no matter what, metaphors really do matter, because they really are, they have the power to create a new reality, because we speak and live through metaphors often. And climate science itself uses many metaphors, such as the greenhouse effect, such as carbon footprints, etc. And scientists who have researched metaphors in climate change show us that there's a tendency to universalize climate change impacts into impacted and non-impacted dual dichotomies. And then they basically, like this idea of us and other, or, cost benefit dualisms that actually need to be transcended in that quantum world. So metaphors, they're very much part of the stories we tell about how, like our role in society, how we relate to that. And quantum leap is a popular metaphor that we use. We need to make a quantum leap to sustainability. And we often use the word, the idea of entanglement. Oh, we are very much entangled. The practical, political, and personal spheres are entangled. But it's more than actually a metaphor. It's the nature of reality. And this is something that, Karen Barad writes, that entanglements are uniquely quantum mechanical. And there's something that is very different about them, that it's not a causal relationship, it's a correlated relationship, or co-related. We are related to each other. When we know something about one measurement, we automatically get information about another. And again, this is where entanglement through language comes out, that it's not that, we start to see that meaning is changing collectively around the world as we're starting to become self-aware. And it brings us into, the idea of consciousness. And I won't go through the entire book now, just to wrap up so we have some time for questions. But consciousness is often, if we're talking about consciously transforming society, and we don't actually include any discussion of consciousness, what it is, where it is, how, what does it mean, etc. We're kind of leaving out this, do we have the capacity, the free will, are we able to transform, or are we just on a trajectory where, one thing leads to another, and that 4-degree, 5-degree warmer world is heading our way. And in the Earth system figure that I showed you earlier, we talk about the atmosphere, we talk about the biosphere, we talk about the cryosphere, the hydrosphere, all these things, but we don't talk about the noosphere, or our collective patterns of thought and meaning making, especially in relation to the biosphere. And I think that, for me, when we're talking about the Anthropocene epoch as a proposed epoch of, geological, expressing our geological impacts on planet Earth, one aspect of the Anthropocene is that we are becoming self-aware that we are transforming systems, global systems like the climate system. And so that self-awareness, I think, once one part of the system becomes self-aware in an entangled system, then the system itself is, changing. And for me, that idea that we can transform economic systems and social systems, and we can have impacts that are non-local and that feed in, just like with the climate system, we start to see that we actually have a lot more agency, and we can create patterns. We can create these fractal patterns that are specific to different contexts, but actually play out as in alignment to whether we call them the Sustainable Development Goals or Agenda 22 or the 2050 Vision for Biodiversity, or anything that actually is conducive to protecting the global environment. So when we get back to that practical, political, and personal spheres, and we see them as a fractal of change, something that is creating a new pattern that is not just that's out there, but I'm coming in with values that apply. If my values apply just to myself and those close to me or whatever, then I create a fragment. But if I can apply values such as equity and justice and dignity and compassion and all the values that are, we saw on those Cheers to Everyone, then we actually see that you actually matter, like that you matter. We, we're mattering in the moment, as Karen Barad says. And I think that gives us a much broader sphere of influence than just, I work in the practical sphere, you work in the political sphere, and we're working in the personal sphere. But we all have spheres of influence. And if we look at this adaptation of Mark McCaffrey and Avi Bomik's Powers of 10 framework, we see that the individual, or 10 to the 1, or P0, in the very center of that, that you and me, we actually are always engaged with family and friends and personal networks and communities and villages and neighborhoods and meta communities and urban, all the way up to all Homo sapiens who have ever lived. And you could say that all life that has ever lived. And so we are then entangled at all scales. And I think if we start to take a fractal approach to scaling change and think about what patterns am I creating right here and right now, here in Oslo, or on this Zoom call with Mexico City, what is it that, how are we actually shifting those larger systems and structures? So this is just a little bit of the inquiry that I've been going through on transformative change, a little bit on that, trying to get to the how of transformative change. And to me, it's very much that it's not just about having a crystal ball and saying, oh, this is what's the future is, this is where we're heading, and that we certainly are heading in a certain direction, but we also our fingerprints are all over these crystal balls and the models and things. And so what kind of a future are we at creating, and what is the role of individual agency, collective agency, and political agency in creating that future? So for me, transformative change, I think, is something that is something that needs to be taken much deeper as we look at ourselves in terms of relationships to, and I include relationship to myself, to each other, to nature, to change itself, and to the future. And when we start to change a relationship, we change everything. So I'll leave you at that and say muchas gracias, and I'm happy to answer any questions.